The day my family erased me, I was holding a piece of 100-year-old maple, the grain feeling like a road map under my fingers. My name is Catherine Green. For 20 years, I was the son in Green and Sons Woodcraft. That shop, the sawdust in the air, the smell of tung oil, it wasn't just my church, it was my entire future. But my family had a different plan. They needed my legacy, my inheritance, and my savings to fund my twin sister's frivolous dream. They told me I was strong. What they meant was I was disposable. They thought they could break me. They had no idea what I could build from the wreckage. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The day my father broke his promise, I was holding a piece of 100-year-old maple so smooth it felt like cool water against my skin. I was hand-rubbing the final coat of tung oil into an heirloom cradle, a commission for the mayor's first grandchild. The oil smelled sharp and clean, like citrus and pine, and the grain of the wood popped, revealing a deep holographic fire. This was my church. The sawdust motes dancing in the sunbeams that cut through the shop's high, dusty windows, the low, familiar hum of the lathe in the corner, the scent of raw timber. This was Green and Sons Woodcraft. And I, Catherine Green, was the son. I'd been the one running the shop, really running it for 5 years, ever since Dad's back gave out. Yesterday he'd come in, leaning on his cane, and run a hand over the cradle's curved rocker. He'd had actual tears in his eyes. He clapped me on the shoulder, his hand heavy and calloused just like mine. "This is all yours, Catherine," he'd said, his voice thick with a pride that made my chest ache. "You've earned every splinter." I clung to that moment, to that promise. I had no idea that in 3 hours that same hand would be signing my entire future away. I'm the artist, the craftswoman, the reliable one, the one who stayed. My hands are a roadmap of my life, calluses built on calluses, a small pale scar on my left thumb from a slipped chisel permanently stained cuticles. I'm the one who manages the inventory, who draws up the designs, who sweet-talks the difficult clients, who balances the books. My twin sister Sophie is the sun. She's all polished, bright, effortless smiles and a marketing degree she just got in Portland. She left Cedar Creek the second she could, and now she was back full of vision, but with hands that were soft and manicured hands that had never bled for this family, for this business. Our mother Helen orbits her. Every laugh from Sophie is a delight, every idea a stroke of genius. My successes, they're just expected. I remember in high school I won a state-level award for a complex marquetry box I designed. That same week, Sophie was voted most likely to brighten your day in the yearbook. Guess which one got a celebratory dinner at the Pines, the one nice restaurant in town? I got a pat on the arm. "That's our Catherine." Mom said, that familiar dismissive affection in her voice. Always so capable. It was never a compliment. It was a cage. For 28 years it's been my cage, but I had a plan to break out. The old glassblower's studio next door. The one that had sat empty for a decade was finally on the market. It was my dream. It was all windows, huge north-facing panes that were cracked and grimy, but I could see the light, the possibilities. It would be a sunlit showroom for my own signature line, Green Originals, where I could build my art, not just commissions. I'd spent the last 6 months developing a full business plan, cross-referencing market data, until 3 a.m. after I'd already finished Dad's books for the week. I had the sketches, I had the projections, I even had the deposit, $15,000 saved dollar by agonizing dollar from side commissions. I did on stolen time, working in the shop between midnight and 4 a.m. My parents had promised the family investment portion, the seed money I needed to secure the loan from the bank. The meeting was set. This Friday. This was the plan. It was solid, built right, just like everything I make. I finished buffing the cradle until it shined like dark honey. I carefully wiped my hands on my heavy canvas apron, the one stained with a decade of my life, and rolled up the blueprints for the new studio. I was actually smiling as I walked the short path from the shop to the house, the gravel crunching under my boots. I was picturing the look on their faces when I showed them the final layout, the one that included a small teaching space. But when I pulled open the kitchen door, the familiar warmth was gone. The mood was wrong. It was cold, sterile. Sophie was sitting at the head of the big oak table, my grandfather's table, her slick new laptop open. My father was at the other end staring at his hands. And my mother, Helen, was standing at the sink, her back to the room, rigid as a board. She didn't turn. She didn't greet me. My blueprints suddenly felt heavy, childish, and stupid. The smile slid from my face. "Catherine, honey," my father started, and the floor dropped out from under me. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wood grain on the table. "Sophie has a presentation. There's been a change of plans." Sophie clicked a button on her wireless remote. The TV screen mounted on the kitchen wall lit up with a sleek, soulless logo, "Green Living," written in a breezy lowercase font that looked like it belonged on a bottle of cheap perfume. Her presentation was a masterclass in deflection. It was all buzzwords. Synergy, direct-to-consumer, lifestyle brand, recontextualizing the rustic aesthetic. She had a vision, all right. A vision to liquidate the Green and Sons brand, the name my grandfather had built with his bare hands, and stop all custom work. Immediately. She wanted to mass-produce cheap, rustic-style furniture flat-packed, sourced from an overseas factory she'd found on Alibaba, with maybe a final coat of stain applied here for a made-in-America loophole. "It's about scaling, Dad," she said, clicking to a slide filled with bar graphs that were all bright colors and no substance. "We have to capture the millennial market. They don't want heirloom pieces. They want vibe." I just stared numb, the blueprints in my hand, suddenly feeling like a child's crayon drawing. My dream, my life's work, was being recontextualized as obsolete. "What?" I finally managed. My voice sounded small, distant, like it was coming from the other side of the room. "What about my studio, the glassblower's shop, the loan? We have the meeting with the bank on Friday." I looked at my father, but he was fascinated by the wood grain on the table. It was my mother who turned from the sink, her hands clutching a dish towel so tightly her knuckles were white. Her voice was firm, rehearsed, as if she'd been practicing the speech in the mirror. "Catherine, honestly, Sophie needs this. She has a real modern vision for the future. You're strong. You've always been the capable one. You have the skill. Sophie has the ideas." It was the old story, the one I'd heard my whole life, but this time it had a steel edge. "She needs this chance, honey. You've always had your work." My father finally looked up. His eyes were flat, all the warmth from yesterday, all the pride gone, evaporated. "It's just a better business decision, kid," he said, his voice flat. "The numbers don't lie. We're liquidating the family investment fund for Sophie's startup." I felt the blood drain from my face. The fund, the whole fund, or just my part?" "We can't fund both," he said and looked away, but they weren't funding both. The truth hit me, like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. They were taking everything. My inheritance, my grandfather's money, my money, the profits I had generated for the last 5 years, all of it, and giving it to her, for particle board. So that's it. My voice was shaking and I hated myself for it. 20 years of my life, my apprenticeship sweeping floors, running the entire shop while you recovered from your surgery, it's all just liquidated. Sophie let out an exasperated sigh and closed her laptop. The TV screen went black. "Catherine, don't be so emotional," she said, her voice laced with that soft, condescending pity that was worse than any shout. "It's just wood. I'm trying to save this family. Can't you see that? You'll land on your feet. You always do. It's just wood. And then, the click. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a tumbler falling into place inside my chest. The world, which had been loud and hot and spinning, suddenly went sharp and quiet and very, very cold. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, it all faded. I looked at the three of them. My father, the coward, my mother, the enabler, my sister, the vulture. And I saw them clearly for the very first time. They weren't my family. They were just strangers. I happened to know people who had been robbing me in broad daylight for my entire life. I slowly, deliberately untied the heavy canvas work apron I was still wearing, the one stained with a decade of my life, my sweat, my blood. I folded it neatly, smoothing the creases, and placed it on the polished oak table right next to Sophie's shiny closed laptop. "If that's your decision," I said, and my voice was new even to me. It was ice cold. All the shaking was gone. "Then I'm done." I turned and walked out the kitchen door, the one I had run through as a child. I didn't slam it. I closed it gently behind me. No one stopped me. No one called my name. I got into my beat-up truck, the one with the cracked windshield, and drove down the street, parking under a dripping pine tree where they couldn't see me. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, shaking so hard I couldn't get the key out of the ignition. I finally fumbled for my phone and opened my banking app, the little blue icon, a beacon of terror. My personal checking account, $5, $280, $41. That was it. Everything I had. I had just been erased from my own life. I was officially locked out. I went to the shop the next morning, foolishly thinking I could at least retrieve my personal tools, the hand planer my grandfather had given me, my set of Japanese chisels. My key slid into the lock and stopped. It wouldn't turn. I stared at the new shiny brass of the deadbolt. They'd changed the locks. Overnight. My stomach twisted. Taped to the glass door was a white envelope. Inside, a typed note not even signed. "Catherine, please respect our new business structure. We will have your personal effects dropped off at your convenience." My personal effects, like I was a disgruntled employee, not a daughter. A week later, the Cedar Creek Community Newsletter came out. I saw it on the counter at the diner. In the business section, there was a small sanitized statement from the new CEO of Green Living, Sophie Green, announcing the exciting new direction of the company. It mentioned my departure with a single brutal line: "We wish Catherine the best in her personal decision to pursue other interests." It sounded like I was the flaky one, the one who had abandoned them. The town was confused. I got a few pitying looks at the grocery store whispers that followed me down the aisles, which felt infinitely worse than anger. I had to find a new place. I found it in the old industrial park on the other side of the train tracks, tucked behind a semi-truck repair shop. It was a drafty single-car garage bay. It smelled like rancid oil-damp concrete and mice. The fluorescent light hummed and flickered. But the rent was cheap. My $5 to $80 evaporated in a single terrifying afternoon. First and last month's rent, a deposit for the electricity, and the last $2,000. I spent that on a used rattling 20-year-old lathe from a guy's shed up in the hills. It was covered in rust, but the motor turned over. My rock bottom was a dusty air mattress in the corner of that garage, my body aching from the cold. The nights were the worst. The late October chill seeped up from the concrete floor right into my bones, no matter how many blankets I piled on. I'd lie there, hands clenched, every muscle rigid. I'd think I heard the familiar, comforting hum of my old shop tools, only to realize with a jolt of panic that it was just the 4 a.m. freight train. Its horn would wail as it rattled past, shaking the thin metal walls of the garage, a sound so lonely it felt like a physical weight. I was terrified, the kind of cold, hollow terror that sits in your stomach and doesn't let you sleep. But I got up, every single day. I'd go to the Cedar Creek Diner, where the coffee was still $1, and nurse a single cup for 2 hours sketching on a napkin trying to figure out a plan. One morning, Ben, the owner, a big man with a permanently grumpy expression, saw me just staring into the cold black liquid, my hands shaking too much to even sketch. He came over, slapped a heavy plate down in front of me. Pancakes and bacon. "I didn't order this," I whispered. "On the house." He grunted, not meeting my eyes. "Heard what your folks did." He didn't pry. He just wiped down the counter and said, "My cousin's got an old belt sander in his barn. Been sitting for years, motor's probably seized. It's yours if you want to haul it." That small kindness, that simple gruff gesture was like a match in the dark. It was the first warmth I'd felt in weeks. I hauled the sander. I took it apart, cleaned the motor, and got it running. Ben was right. Community. That's what my family had forgotten. I couldn't compete with Green Living on volume. I didn't want to. I would compete on art. I would do what my father used to do before he got lazy, true custom commissions. I went to the library, used their free computer to design a simple business card, and spent my last $300 on a box of them and a basic one-page website. The name was simple, Green Originals. I was keeping my name. It was mine. A few days later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. My first commission. It was small, a set of hand-turned display boxes for a local wedding photographer. My hands were shaking as I typed, "I accept." I was in the garage sketching the design, my hands finally steady for the first time in weeks, and I actually felt a spark, a tiny, fragile spark of hope. That's when the garage door rolled up, screeching on its tracks, flooding the space with gray afternoon light. Sophie stood there, backlit, a silhouette of judgment. She was wearing a new cashmere coat the color of oatmeal. She looked at the rusty lathe, at my air mattress in the corner, at me covered in grease and sawdust. "Catherine, what is this?" Her nose wrinkled, a perfect, calculated expression of disgust. "You're embarrassing us." "This is pathetic," Sophie said. Her voice, sharp and high, cut through the quiet hum of my old rattling lathe. I hadn't even heard her car pull up, but here she was standing in the middle of my garage, her $500 boots already dusty. "I mean, really, Catherine, what is this? Mom is an absolute wreck. She's crying herself to sleep." I didn't look up. I kept my hand steady on the tool rest guiding the chisel. The wood for the photographer's box peeled away in a perfect fragrant ribbon. "Mrs. Gable from the bakery stopped Mom in the street," Sophie continued, her voice rising with indignation. "She asked if you were struggling. She asked if you needed a hot meal like you were some charity case. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? People are talking." She stepped further in, avoiding a puddle of melted snow that had dripped from my truck. "They think we the family work out of a shed. You're embarrassing us. You're making us look unstable." I switched off the lathe. The hum died, and the silence in the garage was suddenly heavy, pressing in on us. I turned to her, wiping my hands on my jeans. "What I'm doing, Sophie," I said, my voice flat, all the old warmth I'd ever had for her gone, "is my business. What you're doing is Green Living. How's that going? Scaled up yet?" I saw her flinch. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, but it was there. The dig had landed. She wasn't used to me having fangs. She forced a laugh, a high, tinkling sound that echoed strangely off the thin metal walls. "We're doing fine, actually. We're launching next week." She pulled a glossy trifold brochure from her leather handbag and slid it onto my workbench, right on top of my sketches smudging the charcoal. It was a slick, soulless advertisement for the Green Living launch party, complete with photos of smiling generic models lounging on furniture I knew was just computer rendered. "In fact," she said, her voice dripping with false magnanimity, "that's why I'm here. Dad wants to offer you a job. A real one." I just stared at her. "Come manage the finishing floor," she said, as if bestowing a great gift. "You'd be perfect at it. Real salary, benefits. We can put all this unpleasantness behind us. You can get out of this. Her hand, with its perfectly manicured dark red nails, waved around the garage in a gesture of complete and total dismissal. My garage, my lathe, my life, finishing floor. That's the job they gave to high school kids in the summer. It was staining ceiling and wrapping. It was mindless labor, the last anonymous step before the particle board was shipped. She was offering me the bottom rung of the ladder in the house I had built. I slowly picked up her glossy brochure. I folded it once, very precisely. Then I folded it again. I walked over and handed it back to her. "You're asking me," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "to come back and put your cheap new logo on imported particle board that you're passing off as craft. You want my name, the one people in this town actually trust, to help you sell that garbage." I opened the side door for her. "I'd rather starve Sophie. Now get out of my shop." She stormed out, sputtering about how I was ungrateful and self-destructive and throwing my life away, but I just locked the door behind her. My heart was hammering, but not with fear. It was adrenaline. I turned back to the display boxes and worked for 10 hours straight, my focus absolute. I delivered them the next day. The client, a young wedding photographer named Maya, actually cried when she saw them, her hands tracing the dovetail joints. That night, my phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a notification from the Cedar Creek Community Facebook group, a group every single person in town, including my parents, followed obsessively. Maya had posted a review. It wasn't just a review, it was a declaration. She'd posted a dozen photos of the boxes, the light hitting the grain, the perfect hand-cut joints, and she wrote, "I am in tears. I thought the true craftsmanship of Green & Sons was gone forever, but I was wrong. The real green magic is still alive." Catherine Green is an artist, and her new work from Green Originals has more heart and soul than anything I've seen in years. This is the quality our town is known for. The post exploded. 400 likes in an hour. Dozens of comments. "This is the quality we know. That's the real craft." I knew she wouldn't quit. My phone dinged. And dinged again. 2 new inquiries, then 3. The triumph was a hot, bright coal in my chest, but it was short-lived. The next Friday was the Green Living launch party. They'd poured thousands into it. They'd painted over the historic hand-painted Green & Sons sign on the front of the shop, the one my grandfather had commissioned in 1953. It was just that breezy, soulless Green Living logo, now backlit in an obnoxious, sterile neon blue. They'd hired a catering company from Portland, and the sound of a bad synth-pop band echoed down Main Street. I watched from my truck parked in the shadows across from the diner. I saw my father in a new, ill-fitting suit, looking stiff and unhappy. I saw my mother draped in a silk shawl, laughing too loudly, her eyes darting around to see who was watching. And I saw Sophie, the queen of the ball, raising a glass of cheap Prosecco. It felt like watching a funeral. They were dancing on my grandfather's grave. I couldn't watch anymore. I drove back to the cold garage, the small victory of the Facebook post feeling meaningless against their mountain of money and betrayal. That's when my phone buzzed. An email. The sender was the Cedar Creek Founders Fair Committee. My heart stopped. The Founders Fair was the biggest community event of the year, the one that kicked off the entire tourist season. My fingers were trembling as I opened it. "Dear Ms. Green, we have received a nomination for you to enter the Artisan of the Year Award for your work with Green Originals." I read the sentence 3 times. This was the award. The one Green & Sons had won uncontested for 15 years straight. The one my father always polished and kept on the mantle. They were asking me to go head-to-head. My thumb hovered over the reply button for a full minute. This wasn't just accepting an entry. This was a declaration of war. I thought of the neon blue sign blotting out my grandfather's legacy. I thought of Sophie's pitying, "It's just wood." I clicked accept. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone, but the confirmation email lit up my screen. Just like that, the fuse was lit. It didn't take an hour for the news to be all over Cedar Creek. This wasn't just another entry in the craft fair. This was green versus green. When I went to the diner the next morning, the place went quiet for a second, just like in an old western. Ben just poured my coffee and slid it over. "You're really gonna do it, Catherine?" he asked, his voice low. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Good," he said, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "It's about time." The town was electric with the drama. People I barely knew were suddenly stopping me, offering quiet words of support, a bag of groceries, a free tank of gas. They were taking sides. Green and Sons, which was now the hollowed-out Green Living, represented the institution that passed the family name. But Green Originals, that was me. That was the underdog. That, they whispered, was the real craft. I knew I couldn't just enter something good. It had to be a masterpiece. It had to be a statement. I decided to build one magnificent piece, a legacy piece. I would build a hand-carved rocking chair, made from a single stunning slab of Claro walnut I'd been saving for years, hiding it under a tarp at the back of my garage. I would build it using a complex, forgotten technique my grandfather taught me, not my father. A triple locking dovetail tenon, a joint so precise and difficult that my father always said it wasn't worth the time. It was all my skill, all my history, all my heart poured into one object. For 3 weeks, I didn't exist. I just worked. I cashed in every small commission and poured the money into supplies. I slept on the air mattress in 4-hour bursts, woke up, made coffee on a hot plate, and worked until my hands were numb and my eyes burned from the sawdust. The chair came to life. The walnut grain was like fire, the curves perfect, the balance sublime. It wasn't just furniture, it was a sculpture. It was the best thing I had ever made. While I was buried in my work, Green Living was struggling. The fast furniture wasn't selling. This town was built on quality, and they knew a cheap laminate when they saw one. I overheard gossip at the lumberyard, saw the 50% off grand opening sale, banners getting bigger and more desperate in their windows. My family was feeling the pressure. Their reputation, the one they stole from me, was on the line. They needed to win Artisan of the Year to legitimize their entire hollow venture. The fair was on Saturday. I came to my garage on Thursday morning, 2 days before the event, 2 days to apply the final coats of oil. The air was cold, crisp. I pulled up and my stomach dropped. The heavy-duty padlock I'd bought, the one that weighed 5 pounds, was gone. No, not gone. It was cut. It was hanging open by one loop, swinging gently in the breeze. A cold, sharp dread washed over me, so intense I felt dizzy. I pushed the door open, the metal groaning. My heart was a cold stone in my throat. I looked around. Everything looked fine. My tools were on their racks. The lathe was untouched. The bags of sawdust were still in the corner. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe it was just kids, a failed burglary. And then I saw it. I had left the rocking chair in the center of the garage, draped in a clean white sheet to protect it from dust. The sheet was pulled back, lying in a heap on the floor. I walked toward it, my boots feeling like they were made of lead. It wasn't destroyed. They hadn't taken an axe to it. That would have been a mercy. This was worse. This was intimate. This was surgical. I knelt, my legs giving out. A key structural joint, the complex load-bearing triple-locking tenon I had spent 3 days carving, the one connecting the armrest to the back, was cracked. I touched it, and a splinter of wood bit into my finger. I saw the fresh splintered grain. It had been over-torqued, probably with a heavy-duty pipe clamp stressed just to the breaking point, and then a quarter turn more. It was structurally ruined. It would collapse the second anyone put their weight on it. But they weren't done. I followed the line of the chair up to the headrest, the part I had spent 40 hours carving with an intricate scroll pattern of maple leaves, my grandfather's favorite. A deep, malicious gouge ran right through the center of it. It wasn't a scratch. It was a wound. It was deep, V-shaped, and I knew the tool that made it. A 1-inch bevel-edged chisel, just like the one my father always kept razor-sharp in his back pocket. They had deliberately, viciously severed the most beautiful part of the grain. I slid to the concrete floor. I couldn't breathe. I just held the splintered, violated wood. My hand. I looked down. My palm was bleeding from the splinter. I'm out. It's over. 2 days. It's not enough time. I have nothing. They won. The realization hit me cold and heavy. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't random. This was done by someone who knew wood, someone who knew my joints, someone who knew exactly how to break my work, how to break me. This was my family. I sat there in the cold, dusty light staring at the ruin of my masterpiece. The sorrow was a physical weight pressing me into the concrete. But as I sat there watching my own blood well up in my palm, the sorrow, it just boiled. It didn't evaporate. It hardened. It turned into something cold and quiet and terrifyingly clear. I must have sat there for an hour, maybe 2. The light in the garage shifted and the cold started to seep back into my bones. The blood on my palm had dried to a stiff, dark crust. It was over. I couldn't fix it. Not in 48 hours. A structural break like that, a gouge that deep, it would take a week just to restabilize the wood, and the carving was gone. Annihilated. I had nothing to show. They had won. The cold clarity from before vanished, leaving only a vast gray emptiness. My phone. I pulled it out of my pocket, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. I had to call the committee. I had to pull out. But my thumb hovered over the contacts, and I didn't call the committee. I called Ben. My voice broke on the first word. Ben? I whispered, and it sounded like gravel. I'm out. They broke it. I couldn't say any more. I just hung up. The silence that followed was absolute. I was alone. I buried my face in my knees, the smell of sawdust and my own dried blood filling my nose. Less than an hour later, I heard the rumble of a truck. Then another. The garage door screeched open, flooding the space with harsh daylight. I squinted, my eyes burning. It was Ben, his face a thundercloud. And behind him stood 2 other people. Maria, the metalworker from the industrial park, a small, tough woman with welding goggles pushed up on her massive curly hair, and old Mr. Henderson, the carpenter who'd retired before I even started my apprenticeship, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Ben knelt, his big rough hands hovering over the cracked joint, not touching, just feeling the energy of the break. He looked at the gouge. He looked at me sitting on the filthy floor. "You don't fix it, Catherine," he said, his voice a low growl. "You feature it." I just stared at him, my mind blank. "It's crippled, Ben. It's ruined." Maria stepped forward, pushing her safety glasses up. She ran a single calloused finger over the deep V-shaped gouge, her touch surprisingly delicate. "No," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "It's not. Have you ever heard of kintsugi?" I shook my head, numb. "It's Japanese," she said, her eyes suddenly lighting up with a fierce creative fire. "The art of mending broken pottery with liquid gold. They believe the piece is more beautiful, more valuable for having been broken. The repair is part of its story." She looked from the gouge to the cracked joint, then back to me. "We don't have gold. But I have a crucible, a propane torch, and a shit ton of brass." She looked at me, her gaze intense, challenging. "We'll inlay the crack. We'll fill that ugly, hateful scar. We will make the break the most beautiful part of the chair." A new kind of energy surged through me. It wasn't hope. It was something harder, colder. It was focus. For the next 48 hours, my garage wasn't a garage. It was a forge. It was a war room. We worked under the harsh, buzzing glare of shop lights, the air filled with the smell of stale coffee sawdust and the sharp metallic tang of flux and hot metal. Ben and Mr. Henderson, with his decades of knowledge, helped me carefully widen the crack, stabilizing the joint from the inside with hidden steel pins, making it physically stronger than it had ever been. And Maria was a wizard. She melted the brass ingots in her crucible, and with a hand as steady as a surgeon's, she poured the molten metal a glowing river of fire into the scar, into the cracked joint. It hissed as it met the wood, a violent, beautiful union. I worked with a terrifying, precise fury, sanding the cooled brass until it was perfectly flush with the walnut, until it shined like a vein of solid gold. The chair was reborn. The brass inlay didn't look like a repair. It looked like a lightning strike caught and frozen in the wood. It looked like the chair had held all that power, all that violence, and survived. The Founders' Fair was chaos. The town square was packed a sea of families and tourists. The green living booth was impossible to miss. It was huge, triple the normal size, all white plastic banners, and blinding silver spotlights even in the middle of the day. They had rows of their wobbly laminate tables and cheap identical chairs all roped off like a museum exhibit. My booth was tiny, tucked at the end of the artisans' row. I didn't have banners. I didn't have spotlights. I just had the chair sitting on a simple black dais. It was the only thing in my booth, and it glowed. The afternoon sun hit the brass, and you could see it from 50 yards away. It was a beacon. I saw them coming. My father David, my mother Helen, and Sophie. They were walking the row, all practiced smiles, shaking hands, the reigning royalty of the fair. Then they saw my booth. They saw the chair. They stopped dead. My mother's smile froze, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of pure theatrical shock. Sophie's face, which had been bright and smug, went slack, her mouth parting slightly in confusion. But my father's face went pale, a sick ashen gray. He stared at the brass inlay, his eyes tracing the line of the scar, then snapping to the mended joint. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew the break, and he knew the mend. He knew I knew. The judging began an hour later. The committee, 3 community leaders, and a severe-looking curator from a prestigious Portland art gallery moved down the line. They spent less than 30 seconds at the Green Living booth, nodding politely at Sophie's rehearsed speech about lifestyle integration and market synergy. Then they came to my booth, and just like my family, they stopped. The head judge, the curator, walked slowly, circling the chair. She didn't speak. She just looked. She leaned in her eyes, tracing the line of molten brass, seeing how it flowed seamlessly into the walnut grain. She touched the inlay, her fingertip tracing the path of the original hateful gouge. The entire town square seemed to go quiet, everyone waiting, sensing the tension. Finally, she straightened up. She looked at me, her eyes sharp, not with pity, but with a kind of fierce, profound curiosity. "Tell me about this," she said, her voice clear and carrying. I looked past her, past the crowd, and my eyes locked with my father's. He was frozen, trapped, watching me. I took a deep breath. "It's about resilience," I said, my voice steady, amplified by the sudden hush. "It's about how the things that are broken, the things someone tried to destroy, can be mended and be made stronger and more beautiful than they ever were before." I saw my father flinch, a sharp, involuntary jerk of his whole body, as if I'd just walked up and slapped him across the face. The silence stretched. The curator held my gaze for a long, heavy moment, then nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. She wrote something on her clipboard and moved on. We all stood there in the bright, cloudless afternoon waiting. My family hadn't moved. They were a frozen tableau of guilt and anger trapped in the center of the town square, their smiles gone, their faces pale. An hour later, the mayor stepped up to the main stage podium holding the heavy bronze Artisan of the Year plaque. "This was a difficult decision," he began, his voice booming over the speakers. "We had incredible entries this year showing real vision." I saw Sophie straighten up, a flicker of that old, confident smirk returning to her face, smoothing her dress. "But this year," the mayor continued, his voice shifting, becoming more serious, "the judges weren't just looking for vision, they were looking for something more. They were looking for skill, yes, but they were also looking for heart, for resilience, for a reminder of what this town at its core is really all about. Not just where we're going, but where we came from." He paused, looking out over the crowd, his eyes finding me in my small booth. This year's Artisan of the Year award isn't just for skill, it's for heart, for reminding this entire town what the name Green really means. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father shut his eyes. The award goes to Catherine Green of Green Originals. For a second, there was dead silence, the entire town processing the monumental shift. Then a single piercing whistle cut through the air. It was Ben from the back of the crowd. And then the town square erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a genuine roar. People were stamping their feet, cheering, whistling. Ben was hugging a beaming Maria, lifting her clear off the ground. Mr. Henderson, standing beside them, was wiping his eyes with a plaid handkerchief. The entire community, my community, was on its feet, turning a wave of validation and warmth toward me. I was pushed forward by a dozen friendly hands, my legs numb. I walked up the steps to the stage, my whole body shaking. The mayor handed me the heavy bronze plaque. It was real. It was heavy. I gripped the podium, my knuckles white. I looked out at the sea of cheering faces, and then my gaze found my family. They were still standing there, frozen, a toxic island in a sea of celebration. They couldn't leave. To leave now would be to admit everything. "Thank you," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone, clear and steady. "Thank you so much. I didn't make this piece alone. I made it with the help of my friends, with the help of this community, who believed in me when I couldn't." I lifted the plaque, letting the sun hit the polished bronze. "This piece," I said, my eyes locked on my father's, "is dedicated to my family, who taught me in their own unique way that you have to build your own foundation." It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. And the entire town got it. There was a sharp collective intake of breath, followed by another louder cheer. My mother looked like she was going to be sick. Sophie was staring at me, her face pale with pure, unadulterated hatred. My father just looked broken. The aftermath was a blur. My family was left standing utterly alone. No one approached them, no one spoke to them. They were socially annihilated. They finally slipped away through the crowd, like shadows. I, on the other hand, was swarmed. People were pressing business cards into my hand, shaking my hand, hugging me. "A dining table just like that. My wife's anniversary. Can you build a full bedroom set?" The Portland curator. The severe-looking woman pushed through the crowd, her face no longer severe. "That was not just craft, Ms. Green. That was art. My gallery is holding a Voices of the Northwest exhibit in the spring. I want that chair in it. And I want whatever else you can build by then. Don't, and I mean don't, sell that chair to anyone else." A week later, the Green Living storefront was dark. The desperate 50% off banners were gone, replaced by a single stark white "For Lease" sign taped to the inside of the glass door. The gamble had failed. Sophie's hollow vision had shattered against the bedrock of a town that still valued quality. The news was all over town. They were ruined. They had liquidated the entire family fund and poured it into cheap imported inventory that no one wanted and that they now couldn't even sell. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt quiet. I was busy. With the deposits from the fair, with the advance from the Portland gallery, I had finally signed the lease on the old glassblower's studio. It was mine. I was standing in the middle of the empty, sun-drenched main room's sawdust from my first setup day already on the floor, when the door creaked open. My father walked in. Alone. He looked 10 years older. His shoulders slumped, the old confidence completely gone. He looked around the bright, beautiful space, my dream space, with dead eyes. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough, hollow, We're filing for bankruptcy." He stood there for a long time, this ghost in my new sunlight. The man who had been my hero, the one whose approval I had chased my entire life, looked small and frail against the bright, open potential of my new studio. The afternoon sun streamed through the grimy north-facing windows, illuminating the dust motes his entrance had disturbed. He didn't apologize. I knew in that moment he never would. Apologies were for people who thought they were wrong. He just explained. Your mother. He started, his voice rough, hollowed out. He stared at a sunbeam hitting the dusty floor, unable to meet my eyes. Helen. She wanted to give Sophie a win. Just once. He looked up at me, then his eyes pleading for an understanding that I no longer had to give. She always felt so guilty, Catherine. Guilty that you got all the talent, that you were always enough. Sophie was just Sophie. She always struggled. She thought, if we just gave her this one thing, your thing, she'd finally be happy. She'd finally feel like she'd won. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the clarity of it was a cold, sharp shock worse than the sabotage itself. I had braced myself for greed. I had understood jealousy. I had even in my darkest moments been able to comprehend a cold, ruthless business decision. But this was infinitely worse. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about scaling. It wasn't even about hatred for me. It was about pity for her. They hadn't sacrificed me because I was weak. They had sacrificed me because I was strong. They had seen my capability not as a gift, but as a resource to be plundered, a foundation they could tear apart to build a house for someone they thought was weaker. It was the ultimate betrayal. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the dusty air sharp as a chisel. So you sacrificed my future, I said, the one I earned, for her feelings. He flinched, the simple cold truth of it hitting him. He looked around my new empty studio, his eyes cataloging the space, the light, the potential. The old David Green, the businessman, was still in there somewhere, flickering behind the panic. Come back, Catherine, he said, taking a desperate step toward me. It was the old command, just dressed in a beggar's robes. Save Green and Sons. We'll make you a full partner. 50-50. We'll do it your way. The custom work. All of it, please. He even tried to smile, a pathetic, twitching gesture. It's your name after all. I looked at him. This man, this stranger, standing in my studio trying to hand me the keys to my own cage. And the most amazing thing happened. Nothing. The hot, boiling rage that had fueled me for months, that had poured molten brass into my work. It was gone. The deep, cold sorrow that had lived in my bones like the Oregon damp. It had evaporated. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just done. The long, exhausting race was over. All the years I'd spent trying to be the perfect son, trying to earn the pat on the head he'd given me over that cradle, it all just fell away. I wasn't his son. I wasn't his capable daughter. I was just Catherine, and Catherine was enough. I'm sorry, Dad, I said, and I think I almost meant it. I can't. He was stunned, genuinely, utterly shocked. He couldn't comprehend it. But it's your legacy, he whispered, as if I were a child throwing away the crown. It's Green and Sons. I smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't triumphant. It was just a real, gentle smile. I walked over to the corner where I'd left my few tools. I picked up a simple push broom. No, I said, turning back to him. I gestured to the empty, sun-drenched room, to the name on my new lease, the name on my new life. This is... I pulled the broom across the floor, the shh of the bristles on the old wood, the only sound in the room. A clean sweep. This is Green Originals, and I have work to do. He just stood in the doorway for a long, long time, a ghost in my new life, watching me clean my new home. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I just kept sweeping. I was finally free. And so Catherine Green swept out the last of her old life, finally making room for her own. What did you think of her final choice? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.